Hello everyone, welcome to Psych, and today I'm going to try to make this video a bit briefer than the other ones. I just want to talk about the idea of rational versus irrational functions and how Jung described them, the differences between them, and why this distinction matters. Let's get into it. So, rational and irrational is one of the primary categories and differentiators that Jung used when talking about specific functions. The rational functions are thinking and feeling, while the irrational functions are intuition and sensing. So essentially you'll notice that the judging functions are rational and that the perceiving functions are irrational. So what does it mean to be a rational function versus an irrational function? Well, rational functions are essentially ones that come to their decisions and conclusions through some sort of rational process. There has to be some kind of internal decision-making process related to whatever thought they're coming to. It has to be weighed against something else in terms of, is it valid? So, for example, if you look at thinking, this is the one that makes the most sense when you're talking about rationality, because of course thinking tends to be quite rational. Does this logically make sense? If I compare this to this other solution and look at all the variables in my head, does it make sense? And that's one of the primary differentiators between rationality and irrationality, is that the rational types need it to make sense on some sort of logical level, or as we see with the feeling function, moral or ethical level. People might say that feeling is not a rational function because how can feeling be rational? You're not using logic. Well, feeling comes to rational conclusions using morals and ethics as the rationale for that decision-making process, which is to say that feeling types are just as rational as logic types. They use the same kind of thought processes, but they're approaching it from the other side of the rational spectrum, which is to say that they're using people's feelings, morals, and ethics to come to those conclusions instead of whether or not this is logically sound or productive. Irrational functions are in contrast with rational functions in that they don't require some sort of rational conclusion or methodology to come to a conclusion compared to those functions, which is to say that the irrational functions tend to be far more impressionistic in how they're going to be receiving information and how that information is going to be considered important to them. Whereas the rational dominant types need things to make sense. It tends to be a little bit more of a black and white kind of category. This is either logically sound or morally ethical, or it's not. The irrational types don't tend to view information in this way, and they tend to be more so inspired by their perceptions. And you'll often find that the irrational dominant types are going to be the ones who interact with information and make decisions based on how it kind of impresses them, essentially, how it essentially is going to be impacting them and their psyche. They're going to be more so interacting with it in a less rational sense. They don't need to make some sort of final conclusion regarding information, especially information that's related to being in the rational field. You'll often find that perceiving dominant types are reluctant to make final decisions regarding logic or ethics because they tend to view these things more so as tools that are going to be supporting them in their perceptions. They aren't the final goal themselves. This is very noticeable when you look at types like the introverted types who have the P and J as opposite of what their dominant function is. So for example, INTPs, despite being a P type, are judging dominant types and therefore rational dominant types. Therefore, they prefer to view things through a rational lens. They are introverted thinking dominant types. Now, INTJs, on the other hand, have introverted perceiving as their dominant function, introverted intuition, and therefore they tend to view things through an irrational lens. They're going to be far more interested in how their perceptions play into whatever it is they're doing than whether or not it logically makes sense compared to, say, the INTP. Now, each side has its benefits and its drawbacks. So the rational dominants have the benefit of being quite deeply rooted and attached to whatever it is that they've rationally decided on, because to them, if they've gone through the rational process of making some sort of decision, they've decided that this thing makes sense to me, therefore it has to be right because the rationale around it makes sense, they're usually going to be quite strongly attached to this, and they're usually going to be very willing to fight for this. And this is very valuable in certain situations like ethics or logic when you're working in the sciences or in the humanities. Now, you'll find that on the other side of this, though, they might be reluctant to want to stop and view the possibilities, to engage in their perceiving functions related to these rational functions, and they might not find themselves engaging in the process of really collecting enough information related to this decision before they make that final strong decision. It's harder for rational dominant types to uplift or withdraw a decision after it's been made compared to the perceiving dominant types, but they're also going to be much more willing to fight for what they believe is logically sound or ethically correct compared to the perceiving dominant types. This is because the perceiving dominant types, the irrational dominant types, have secondary and tertiary rational functions, and therefore, as I said earlier in the video, they view these things as tools and they're not the final most important decision that needs to be made. The irrational types are more so interested in what their perceptions mean to them, and therefore they're not going to be very willing to make those kind of final ultimate judgment calls related to things in the ethical moral field or the logical field. So it's kind of a struggle for both of these separate categories here to meet in the middle and sometimes do the thing that's opposite to them. The rational dominant types need to engage in their irrational perceiving functions if they want to view all of the possibilities, while you might find that the irrational perceiving dominant types are going to be too interested in their own perceptions, or they're not going to be allowing themselves to get into the position where they need to make that decision, even if that decision needs to be made. They might be reluctant to want to make some sort of final decision, even if it's important for them to do so. All right, everybody, those are the basic differences between rational and irrational functions. If you have any questions about that, feel free to comment down in the comment section below. If you have any stories or things related to this, also feel free to tell those down below as well. So this week's video was a little bit shorter because I started my graduate program this past week and I've got a lot going on and I just want to make sure I've got time to get everything done. Hopefully in the next few weeks everything will be back to normal. I'll be back on track with my videos. I want to thank you all for watching. I want to remind everybody that I do have personality typing sessions available at my website, asuracyc.com, if you're interested in working with me to find out what your personality type is and what that means for you. This has been Asura from Asura Psych. Have a good one.